With AC Shadows, Ubisoft set out to make history more inclusive, and somehow contrived to insult two civilizations at once. The newest chapter in this epic is Claws of Awaji and lands on September 16 for a cheap $25 that buy you 10 whole hours of narrative, attempts to fix the main story, for an around $70 base game that most reviewers already called bland. So let's use this little insult as the pretext to talk about the character at the center of this whole disaster, and why the way he's written doesn't just miss the point, it edges into being racist towards the Africans he supposedly represents. Welcome back to Toasty Gaming. Ubisoft, ever generous, has arrived at your door with the modern sacrament, at least if you read gaming media, a $25 story pack promising over 10 hours of attempts to fix the main narrative, neatly bolted onto the $70 chassis that critics described as bland and rather uninspired on release, and then somehow forgot they had described it as bland and uninspired the moment PR sent over a fresh URL. This is the late capitalist refinement of the art: sell you the stale pizza at full price, and then sell you a plate of garlic bread, whose chief virtue is that it's slightly less stale, and then watch how all the food critics discover notes of rosemary and redemption. But that isn't what matters here. Claws of Awaji matters because it gives us permission to revisit Yasuke, the so-called African samurai who was meant to be Ubisoft's banner of inclusivity and ends up as a lesson in erasure. Japan gets the comic book treatment, Oda Nobunaga recast as Saturday morning villain who exists to be morally corrected by an outsider, and Africa gets the action figure, a burly silhouette with dreadlocks and a katana, a universal black template which reminds me more of an American, reskinned for Sengoku Japan. It is a spectacle of bad intentions turning into even worse results. So throughout this video you will hear me say that Ubisoft's handling of Yasuke is not merely thin or poorly written, it is honestly just racist towards the coastal Africans he almost certainly would have resembled. And because I've just finished a university paper on East Africa around 1500, let's do the radical thing Ubisoft's consultants chose not to do. Take the words on the character sheet seriously and ask what they actually mean in the historic context. First of all, the words "born in the captaincy of Mozambique" do not mean what you think. You've seen the tidy line on wikis and in marketing blurbs even. Yasuke born circa 1555, captaincy of Mozambique, Portuguese Empire. To a modern reader that feels solid, like there was a province, a people, an identity called Mozambican from which one might casually be scooped and shipped across the world. It is reassuring, it is modern and ultimately incorrect. In the mid-16th century, Mozambique was not a nation, not an ethnicity and not even a useful historical category. The term referred first and foremost to the Ilha de Mozambique, a coral island on which the Portuguese had planted a fort, a customs post and a small settlement, more or less a Vitoria. The name later swelled across European maps, expanding to cover large tracts of coastline as cartographers learned to draw bigger outlines than they could actually govern. Locals did not call themselves Mozambican, even Portuguese clerks were not going to call a man from Kilwa, Mombasa or Sofala, any of the large city-states along this coast, Mozambican. People named themselves by city and then for wider classification by religion. They were a Kilwan, a Mombasan, a Sofalan, and overarchingly Swahili townspeople on an Islamic coast. That is why historians write about the Swahili coast rather than a 16th century Mozambique. The former denotes a real world of mostly city-states, strong Islamic influence, ancient lineages, and a trade society. The latter is a colonial label that conceals more about the area than it actually reveals. There's a reason why a major volume on this area, which actually goes all the way into the modern era, is called The Swahili World, edited by LaViolette and some other person, and isn't actually called The History of Mozambique from Antiquity to the Modern Day, because that's just not a historical classification that is useful in trying to describe this area. Which means that before we even reach Japan, Ubisoft's inclusive biography has already replaced a living African culture with a European cartographic convenience that wasn't even correctly applied for the era. That is not representation, that is honestly rather pathetic and somewhat ironic, as your attempt to tell a great anti-colonial progressive narrative ended up with you using an evil white colonial term to denote where your second protagonist is coming from, which is honestly sad, considering how many employees Ubisoft has who should have maybe potentially noticed that mistake. But what even was this coast Ubisoft has so successfully erased? It was mostly urban, Islamic, mercantile, and not really much of a warrior factory. If you want the real setting for a man like Yasuke, you need to understand the Swahili coast, the chain of littoral city-states that ran from modern-day Somalia down into what later Europeans would collectively christen Mozambique. Think of a necklace of towns, Mogadishu, Malindi, Mombasa, Kilbo, Sofala being the foremost among them, each with its own major mosques, each with authority over the town and a sliver of hinterland, all of them plugged into the Indian Ocean's wind-timed trade circuits centuries before the first Portuguese even made their way there, specifically Vasco da Gama. These societies were urban and mercantile. They exported ivory, gold, mangrove timber, as well as captives, chiefly from the interior, and imported textiles, beads, ceramics, even porcelain, as well as many ideas from the wider Islamic world. They spoke Swahili, a Bantu tongue thick with Arabic vocabulary, and their elites curated Hadrami and Gulf genealogies because social honor tracked back to your ability to anchor your family story in the wider Islamic world, and most decisively, their social ideal was not the warrior. Status came from wealth and its generous as well as ostentatious display. Coral stone houses with coins pressed into the foundations for good luck, grave niches that made jewelry a public statement even in death, feasts and performances that raised household prestige before an audience. All of those people knew exactly how to read fine fabrics, finer gestures of the Islamic elite. The word civilized literally was usta Arabo and meant being urban and Arabic-leaning in manners. The contrasting word for the primitive interior peoples was Vashensi. It carried the disdain of the self-consciously urbane for the rustic, unlettered, and almost animalistic. If you actually set that world beside Ubisoft's character, the mismatch is honestly embarrassing. A Swahili townsman might plausibly end up attached to a Jesuit household or a Portuguese captain as a retainer, translator, or guard, roles that existed along the margins of trade and diplomacy, but he would not be the output of some mythical African warrior caste because no such caste sat at the center of this society. The Ubisoft version reads less like a 16th century coastal African and more like a modern American fantasy of African toughness, the type of individual you might find in the less savory parts of a US town, redressed for the Japanese archipelago. An aesthetic extraction that doesn't even fit the area, that's flattened into some glorified banner for your video game. This is where the racist charge, I believe, stops being just some YouTube flourish and actually becomes a matter of description. If you strip a real African culture of its religion, its urban tradition, its trading, its fine intelligentsia, its layered identities, and keep only some muscles and hair that wasn't even worn in this area, and muscles that the people from this region wouldn't even have phenotypically, then what you have kept is not a real depiction of Africa, it's just a racist stereotype of Afro-Americans. Apart from just making Yasuke an Afro-American caricature, Ubisoft also strips him of his religion, which is problematic because religion was not decoration for a man like Yasuke, it was the grammar of life. By the time a child born around 1555 took his first steps along the coast, the towns of the Swahili city-states were overwhelmingly Muslim and had been so for centuries. Mosque courtyards were where a city kept its time, contracts were drafted in Arabic, and basic schooling meant Quranic recitation as well as learning the finer points of culture during the Arabic Golden Age, rather than some, blank slate that Yasuke ends up being in the game. Conversion to Christianity occurred, but it was situational and tied to service, patronage, or baptism within a European household, or it was carried out by the elite in order to improve their relationships with the Portuguese, as they were mostly finding themselves used, abused, as more or less attack dogs by the various Swahili city-states who were trying to use them to get rid of competition. Yet none of these conversions actually wiped out a lifetime of Islamic socialization overnight. A plausible Yasuke is therefore guaranteed to be Muslim by birth, regional upbringing along the coast with a strong cosmopolitan bent, getting to know traders from as far as India, maybe even Malaysia, and if he passes into a Jesuit care, then he carries a hybrid identity. He already is shaped by religion, he probably speaks multiple languages, having learned them in a port town, and he probably, if he is upper class, which you can assume, as otherwise he wouldn't be entering into Jesuit service, he probably also has a good basic understanding of Islamic legal tenets that is intellectually interesting in every direction, especially as he would have come from a much more interconnected world than the Europeans. For the Europeans actually reaching beyond, Europe, even by the mid-16th century was something novel. whereas the Islamic world at this point in time was the dominant force, the cultural superpower, and was experiencing a golden age. Islam stretched all the way from the West African coast in Mali to very far in the east towards the Malaysian and Indonesian archipelagos. It reached as far north as the outer Balkan reaches of the Ottoman Empire and as far south as the, southernmost tips of India, as well as the southernmost tips of the Swahili coast. And within this Islamic world, everyone within the elite spoke Arabic. Everyone followed the same Islamic legal tenets. Everyone had the same religion, at least within the urban trader class, as well as the general just upper crusts of society. So you're looking at one of the most, if not the most, interconnected societies during this era. And you're looking at someone who came from an important trade hub within the Indian Ocean trade within this wider Islamic world. So if Yasuke was upper class, or at least close to being upper class, which is once again very likely if he was taken into Jesuit care, as the Christians, the Portuguese or the Jesuits, didn't just grab any random lowlife off the street to act as translator or as bodyguard. They were actually picking people of somewhat respectable social status. Then Yasuke would probably have a decent understanding of the surrounding world and would actually not be as culture shocked as a European might be, and actually would be much more capable to maneuver himself through a more diverse environment just by virtue of Islam being the dominant cultural force across most of the world at this point in time. Yet none of this interesting background survives Ubisoft's hipster writing. Their Yasuke is not Muslim, not recognizably Swahili, not marked by a port's cosmopolitan etiquette that is bound into a wider Islamic world. He is a blank vessel designed to fill a slot in a failed Western morality play, and I believe at this point these aren't just oversights due to incompetence. I believe it's just willful ignorance. I'm getting a strong feeling that no one actually bothered to do much more than do one minimal Wikipedia search on where the Portuguese could have realistically gotten an African around 1555, then someone read Mozambique and then immediately just threw that in as a character background without any further thinking or without even any attempts to immerse yourself into the East African culture that existed along this coast during 1555, which is obviously the core basis of what you have to do if you want to write a believable character from this area. Speaking of Wikipedia claiming you could randomly grab people off the streets in some area called Mozambique that didn't even really exist in 1555, there's an important structural point here to make, because it matters for plausibility. Portuguese authority on the coast in this period was maritime and intermittent, as described by, for example, Michael and Pearson in his book Port Cities and Intruders, not territorial and deep. Forts and custom houses could concentrate force at specific moments, but trade networks were very old and very easily reroutable. If Quilva, for example, a major city-state, was squeezed by the Portuguese, then shipments suddenly appeared at other city-states. Forced tribute from one town would lead to the value already being shifted to other neighbor towns that were less pressured by the Portuguese. Disease environments did the rest. European bodies just ultimately failed inland for centuries, and genuine inland power projection belongs to a much later age of medicine and empire. If you want to put it down to one specific discovery, it would be the discovery of quinine, as quinine has very strong fever-controlling, fever-lowering properties, and most of the sicknesses within the African interior are tied to fever. There are actual descriptions of entire expeditions just being more or less wiped out by fever within, the further inland areas of Africa, which always forced the Europeans to act via coastal intermediaries for basically everything they wanted to have done on the African continent. The Europeans' inability to move land inward actually forced them to be rather cooperative with most of the coastal societies, as the Europeans just couldn't use force effectively, as if you don't control the means of production further inland, you can bombard as many ports as you want. The trade's just going to be A, rerouted, or B, if people are too scared of your military might, then they're just not even going to export anything, and that's it. So the Europeans, and early on especially the Portuguese, more or less were forced to integrate themselves into the centuries-old Indian Ocean trade, all the way into the 17th century when the Portuguese rolled around and found out that you can just force people to work on a spice plantation, and suddenly you no longer need to be all that friendly and diplomatic with the locals. Along the Swahili coast in 1555, you do not just casually abduct townspeople in cities that you need for your income. You cultivate relationships, you take captives through African intermediaries, and transact at the edges of legality, in order to avoid precisely the sort of reputational explosion that would close a harbor and divert trade caravans. The image of Yasuke as a burly Mozambican scooped up at random and shipped to Japan may be fitting if all your understanding of the world comes from some leftist American college campus, but it is ultimately just incorrect and has nothing to do with real history. So what would a plausible Yasuke even look like? Well, if we put the pieces together, then we've got a somewhat coherent figure. A Swahili urbanite, Muslim by origin, probably multilingual, port life makes one so, possibly baptized in service, functioning as a retainer or guard within a Jesuit entourage, absorbing and negotiating new codes as he crosses into unfamiliar codes, yet finding himself very much a member of the domestic culture as long as he doesn't leave the Islamic world. He's not empty, he is a rather vivid person that is shaped by a lot of various coastal as well as cultural influences and heavily shaped by an understanding of a wider Islamic world. He would also carry the pride of a town that has traded with Arabia and India and even seen Chinese porcelain long before Lisbon pretended to control this territory. The hauteur that comes with being usta arabo among people you are trained to consider Vashensi will make him, well, rather snobbish and haughty. We see this even in historical sources, for example in the Travels of Ibn Battuta, where anywhere outside this rather vast Islamic world, he acts as though he's surrounded by unwashed barbarians. This would actually be a very interesting and complicated perspective for a man that travels to Japan, and it could complicate the story in all sorts of interesting ways. He wouldn't be somewhere who fixes Japan, he wouldn't be somewhere of higher virtue or greater understanding than the Japanese, but he would certainly come with a much more cosmopolitan and probably also much more adaptable perspective than either the Portuguese or the Japanese. Ubisoft murdered this historically and culturally coherent individual in order to grab his skin color. They funnily enough committed the ultimate racism. They judged Yasuke not by the content of his character, but by the color of his skin. The racism is becoming rather obvious at this point, and you can even see the symmetry from the other shore. Nobunaga, a unifier still honored in shrines, is rewritten into some broad villain designed to be corrected by foreign morality. Japan is asked to serve as the backdrop for a Western parable about virtue, just as Africa was mined for a marketable silhouette, a skin color ultimately. The exercise flatters nobody who knows either civilization, it flatters only the sensibility that wants history to supply pre-cleansed narratives you can use to quote-unquote educate the unwashed gamer masses. Which brings us back to Claws of Awaji, marketed as the thoughtfully crafted closure that will supply what the base game somehow forgot and end to the main story. But the problem with AC Shadows is structural. When a character is built from erasure, no quantity of DLC pathos will restore the cultures that were removed to make him universally appealing. What the pack offers is 10 hours of aftercare for a grievous, honestly mortal wound Ubisoft inflicted upon themselves, and the chorus of celebration around that offer is part of the comedy. The press discovers depth where there is only padding, meaning where there is only contrition, and the cycle carries on until the next plate of stale garlic bread arrives from the kitchen. If inclusivity means anything, it means choosing the right frame at the very start. In this case, the frame is the Swahili coast, not a Portuguese island's name later inflated into a map. It is urban Islam, mercantile display, littoral politics, Hadrami genealogies, and public familial prestige in ancient trading houses that use coins in their coral masonry. It's a world of ivory, cloth, porcelain, even silk moving on monsoon winds. The texture that makes a person from that world, is all of these things. Replace all of this with just some muscles and a general vibe of some thug from a backwater alley in some US city, and then you've got Ubisoft's depiction of Africa. To sum it all up, Yasuke, if he existed in the form you want to write about, would make sense as a Swahili townsman from the coast, not some Mozambican warrior stamped by a colony that did not exist. The coast itself was urban, Islamic, mercantile, a place where status meant wealth and its beautifully choreographed and generous display rather than institutionalized violence, and Mozambique in this period is a European label, the name of a fort on a coral island and later a cartographer's convenience, not an identity anyone in the major city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa or Sofala, would have claimed. Ubisoft ignored all that and sold you a flat and stereotype-shaped hero to correct Japan on cue. You can call it what you like, but ultimately it is just racist towards the very Africans it pretends to honor and condescending towards the Japanese it pretends to understand. Anyways, this has been my opinion. What do you think? Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and of course, stay toasty. Cheers!